So thanks for the introduction. I also just want to say quickly thanks to Darren and for the organisers of the conference. It's been a very inclusive experience as a speaker, and there's obviously a lot of thought has gone into it. And I've appreciated that as someone who hasn't come through an academic background. So thank you. So to introduce, to introduce myself, my name is Charles Whalley. I've worked in academic publishing for a number of years. I've worked both for for-profit commercial publishers, and I also now work for a charity, for a learning society, a not-for-profit publisher. I am also an elected member of a national level committee within the National Union of Journalists. And previously I've been a workplace rep as well. So I should say that I'm speaking today from a personal capacity. I'm not speaking on behalf of my employer or for the NUJ, but I'll be talking from my perspective as a trade union organizer. And my talk will have a focus on academic journals. Open access in book publishing is a kind of complicated and interesting thing in itself. And I'm also conscious that because of my background and my experience, I'll be talking primarily from a scientific publishing perspective, and also with a very European focus. I'm aware that my perspective is quite limited in that regard. And I will be assuming some level of knowledge on your part about publishing and about open access. I hope I get that level that I'm assuming right. But as I'll be taking questions and comments at the end. So if there's anything that isn't clear, or if you'd like me to clarify something, I'll be happy to do that. Right, I'm just going to turn my camera off so you're not distracted by my lovely face. So just to introduce the NUJ, the National Union of Journalists, first of all, the NUJ has been around for over 100 years. It has tens of thousands of members across all areas of the media, editors, journalists, writers, freelance photographers, marketers, production assistants, working across newspapers, magazines, blogs, book publishing, periodicals, journals, PR agencies, all that sort of thing. The NUJ has many members in academic publishing, sprinkled across all different companies and all different parts of the industry, but with a few particular areas of density and with formal recognition, and particularly at the commercial publishers, Taylor and Francis and Springer Nature. And the NUJ within academic publishing has done work and sort of campaigns, some of which I've been involved in, on topics like diversity, health and safety, when everybody's working from their spare room or kitchen or what have you, the gender pay gap. And also for a long time, the union's been doing some work on the issues for publishing workers around open access, which is what I'm talking about today. So it's not, for me, it's kind of outside of the scope of this talk, and also, frankly, outside of my knowledge to give a full and comprehensive history of open access, but I will just talk a little bit about where open access, where I see it as being now in 2021. By open access, I mean, first of all, when research articles are being published online without barriers to access or barriers to reuse. But I suppose when I say open access, I'm also kind of referring to the advocacy for academic publishing to be done wholly on that basis, the sort of push for open access to be the main form of publishing, rather than publishing being funded by subscriptions and with those awful paywalls that have been around for a long time. Many people who've I mean, the push for open access isn't new. I mean, the internet is it seems weird to be talking about the internet saying it's not new. It's been around for a very long time, and yet the most recent data that we have from 2019, you can see there that only 30% of research articles were published open access online with a Creative Commons license to allow reuse. I would say, though, interestingly, in 2019 was also the first year where more than half of research articles were freely available in some form, maybe without the licensing conditions to allow reuse, or maybe without the final version being freely available. So progress is being made, just not as quickly as perhaps it could be. And the most recent and significant initiative to push towards open access, and the thing that's kind of providing the context for a lot of the most recent discussions and changes around open access, at least amongst scientific journals, is something called Plan S. Plan S being a set of policies agreed by a group of national level and private research funders, mostly in Europe, trying to use their kind of heft and their influence over their funded researchers to push publishing towards open access. So on this slide, I have this is a screenshot from the author guidelines from the journal Nature, which you might have heard of as being one of the sort of oldest and most prestigious, in inverted commas, journals in the sciences. Nature is published by the commercial publisher Springer Nature. I'm kind of using this, I'm sort of picking out Nature as an example, but there was the news story for this year was that as of January of this year, 1st of January 2021, for the first time in its history, the journal Nature allowed authors to publish open access, allowed authors to choose, rather than have their article behind a paywall, they could publish alongside those paywalled articles, they could publish their article open access. But the most kind of striking part of this news story is in that sentence that I've highlighted at the end there, that Nature, as part of this, said, well, if authors wanted to publish open access, they would need to pay a fee, and that fee was the somewhat eye-watering number of nearly 10,000 euros. And so inevitably this, and I'd say probably quite rightly, this fee was criticized. It sort of feels like just a different barrier, possibly an even higher barrier than was there before. If this is how much it's going to cost for authors, this number is far beyond what many researchers could even begin to consider sort of money they could, there's no chance of them finding these sorts of funds for publishing open access. And it just seems like another way to make publishing exclusive. Nature, the journal, in the face of that criticism, argued that this fee was required to cover the cost of publishing the journal, because the journal is very selective and it receives many more submissions than it actually publishes, and all of those submissions require some degree of work. They argued that this high fee is required to cover all of those costs. And the thing is, the journal and the publisher Springer Nature and the journal Nature could quite frankly announce this fee, knowing that there'll be some authors who will pay it. And in the way that research assessment in many places has effectively been outsourced to journals, if you're a scientist and you're trying to build your career, having a publication in Nature is going to be very valuable to you. And so for many authors who want open access or who are required to publish open access because of their funding, 10,000 euros will actually maybe be achievable. And I think what's interesting about the situation we're in now with open access and with this recent change with the journal Nature is that almost all commercial publishers state and will say in kind of public announcements that they support open access, despite being seen as the obstacles to change or slow to change or kind of protective of subscription-based publishing, almost all the big commercial publishers, like Springer Nature with the quote that I've pulled out there, will come out with statements that don't look all that different from what you'll hear from advocates of open access. So here is Stephen Inchcombe, who's the Chief Publishing Officer at Springer Nature, saying that Springer Nature believes that all published primary research should be open to all. And that's not an unusual sentiment for a major commercial publisher to come out with. However, despite all this apparent agreement, there is a very lively and very real debate going on about how that move towards open access is actually going to be achieved. We're kind of in this situation at the moment, particularly around Plan S, where there's statements and counter statements flying back and forward, and it's kind of interesting that they all these statements coming, whether they're coming from trade bodies or commercial publishers or funders or what have you, they all begin with sort of saying how they all agree about the need for open access, and then they kind of immediately go into sort of disagreement about the practicalities of it. And I think kind of one observation of mine about this is I think it does show that whilst the argument for open access should be a moral one, I think there is a strong moral case for academic publishing being done on an open access basis. I think making those arguments and that advocacy solely through abstract moral arguments makes those arguments a bit vulnerable to being captured by CEO speak and by spokespersons from commercial publishers who are very accomplished in speaking in kind of abstract, vague terms about values. And I saw an interesting example of something like this actually. Someone I follow on Twitter pointed out that an American university press has recently announced some new initiative about open access, and they've couched this new initiative in language about collective values and collective goods, whilst at the same time this same university press has been hiring law firms to prevent their staff from unionizing. And I think partly the reason why there is this sort of disagreement about open access and this kind of debate that seems to be sort of raging on almost interminably is that the discussion isn't being held in practical terms, it's being held on the level of values. And I think in order to have that discussion in practical terms, I think the people who hold the key to that are not the senior executives, not the CEOs, but are the publishing workers, are the people who are actually doing the practical things. And I see kind of professionally in my work, and I see in my work with the union, publishing staff and people who work at publishers, commercial or not-for-profit, are having innovative ideas, are incredibly engaged about the need for open access, are sort of working every day on the research that scientists and academics and scholars are entrusting to them, and want to share that research with the world. And I think that's part of the reason. I think I think that's the key to having a conversation on kind of practical terms and actually progressing the debate about open access and how it can actually be realized. I thought I'd just kind of summarize quickly what the situation is like for those publishing workers in the industry at the moment. And I'm aware that many of these pressures, they're not unique to publishing. I think there's an obvious kind of fundamental point here that workers in any industry and across all kind of workplaces and forms of work have a lot in common, and possibly more in common than they realize. I also don't think that the trends that are being felt by publishing workers, I don't think they've been caused by the transition to open access or by the push for open access necessarily. But I do think that the transition to open access has accelerated some of these trends. The push to change the business model of publishing, to push it to open access, has required publishing workers to learn about new things, to learn new skills. I can't really overemphasize how complicated publishing has become, even in the ultimately relatively short time, the 9 years that I've been involved in the industry. Publishing is increasingly, the way that publishing has adapted to different demands for open access and different forms of open access, and just different needs and priorities across a whole sort of global publishing landscape. The way that the industry has adapted to that is by basically running multiple kind of business models alongside each other, and by having sales deals and ways of selling journals that are becoming more complicated by the month even. I think online publishing in general has made the industry more complicated. I think publishers, because digital publishing and online publishing allows journals to do more and allows more kind of data and more utility to be extracted from a research output. I think that that's made publishing as a whole more complicated. And I think often, I guess, born out of frustration, and frustration that I definitely understand, but often in people's frustration at how much publishing costs, or how long publishing can take to happen. If you're sort of waiting for your article to be published online, you often hear people complaining, "Oh, it's all online now. It's just, you're just uploading a PDF to a website. You're just putting a PDF online." And whilst I understand that view, I do sometimes find it quite sort of frustrating and a bit misguided, because I think it doesn't acknowledge or doesn't recognize the work that goes into producing that PDF. That is essentially the only visible end result of that whole process. One major trend in the publishing industry, as in many other industries in recent years, has been outsourcing. And I think that's been accelerated by the move towards open access, because this change in business model creates a sort of downward pressure on the costs of publishing, and publishing companies respond to that by moving work overseas to places where pay and conditions aren't as good as they are in the United Kingdom, which is obviously both exploitative for those workers, but also it requires publishing staff back in the UK to reskill from being the people who were doing the work to the people who were kind of overseeing the work. You know, you might change from being a production editor who actually kind of copy edits or typesets an article to being a sort of supplier manager. And so I think it's clear that open access has a great impact on the industry and on the work of somebody who does publishing. But I also think, to kind of finish my digression, I also think that publishing staff have a great potential to impact open access and to steer and guide that change. However, it's quite obvious to me that that voice isn't heard, and that that viewpoint isn't recognized in the discussions that are happening at the moment about open access. And so if that viewpoint is so valuable, and if it's so necessary to have a discussion about open access in practical terms, why isn't it heard? Why don't publishing workers speak up in this context? And I think there's a few reasons for that. One of the ones that I hear sometimes is that publishing staff, or kind of people who are working on publishing within big publishing companies maybe don't want to be taken to speak for their employer. They don't want, in a context where external statements and communications are obviously so carefully managed and sort of made so kind of abstract and bland in some cases as to be essentially meaningless. Publishing staff might not want to be seen to be kind of participating in that. They might not want to be taken. They might not want their views, which may differ from the official stance of their employer. They might not wish for their views to be seen as being official, as it were. I also think that it's difficult for publishing workers to distinguish their arguments for the value of the work that they do from arguments their employer as a whole might make for why they sort of charge as much as they do. And I think the kind of that difficulty in distinguishing that argument is also felt in my sort of difficulty in articulating that problem. But it's that for someone externally looking at a publishing company, a commercial publisher is just a load of people. It's just its employees. It's not a thing in itself. And an employee of a commercial publisher saying, my work has value. I deserve to be compensated for the work that I've done in producing this product. From someone externally, that argument might be difficult to distinguish that from then a salesperson or a senior executive saying, oh, well, my company should charge this much. And I think that that's kind of has the effect of publishing staff maybe being reticent to kind of speak up for that aspect of their work and of what they do. Also, as perhaps you've seen or kind of felt yourself, the discussion around open access can sometimes get quite heated. I think that many people who are advocating for open access quite reasonably respond to some of the kind of practices of commercial publishers with kind of great frustration and annoyance, which I think is completely justified. And many publishing workers might see that frustration and potentially anger directed at that employer and think, oh, well, I kind of agree with that. Those publishing workers may not share the views of their employer, and so will think, well, why would I stick my head above the parapet and take some of that criticism? And I think the reason for all of these things is I think many publishing workers don't have a kind of independent channel or vessel for their views separate from their employer. Despite what I might want to be the case, trade union membership, trade union recognition, trade union organization isn't at the levels that it could be in many publishing organizations. I mean, I mentioned some examples in my introduction at the start of commercial publishers that do have recognized unions. Many don't. And so many publishing workers don't have a sort of independent voice separately from their employer, through which they can kind of distinguish themselves from their kind of their employer's official statements or their employer's arguments for charging a price and making a potentially obscene profit. And so I think that's why I think those voices aren't heard. I don't think that those are all problems that can't be solved. I do think there are, even so, opportunities for publishing workers to contribute to the discussion about open access. You can see there's a note of optimism, first of all, in my first bullet point there, where I've said yet. I've said union density is not yet high enough. I mean, it's sort of part of my work and my ambition to increase the level of union membership and recognition within the publishing industry. But it is still, I don't want to kind of downplay it. I think there's still the strength within the NUJ and with other trade unions represented in publishing to have an effect and to contribute to on limited topics. I mentioned a few of the kind of campaigns that we've worked on before. I also think sort of stepping aside from trade unions a little bit, I think there's an analogous situation. I'm biased here because I work for a learning society in my day job, but I think that learning societies as democratic member-led organisations that often have own and control journals of their own. I think learning societies who publish are doing some of the most innovative and forward-thinking things about the transition to open access with their publishing programs. And I also think that I'm just, as I kind of mentioned, this situation we're in with kind of statements flying back and forward about open access, I think that it's often just the big wealthy funders and big wealthy commercial publishers sort of talking about the future of the industry without the people who are actually affected by their decisions having an input. And I think that publishing workers on the one side and researchers and scholars and academics on the others sort of deserve to be heard more. And I think that that kind of better understanding of the situation across those sort of parties is probably what's needed there. And that's kind of the purpose of this talk, really, to help give you all a better understanding of the situation of publishing workers, and to maybe hopefully kind of give an angle on the current situation with open access that maybe might lead towards sort of greater input, I would hope, from publishing workers within the commercial companies and publishing workers who I think do have a big part to play in the future of academic publishing. And thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions if we've got time.
Thank you, Charles. That was really interesting, and I particularly want to thank you sort of coming and representing your perspective on this as well, where I think often in library world we come at it from our perspective, but actually getting that external perspective of the actual workers is really valuable to us. And I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the chat, but I think that's something that's coming across quite a lot in there, that actually sometimes we are guilty as a sector of thinking of publishers as being this monolithic organisation and missing out that there are workers within that. I think we do have time for maybe one or two quick questions. So Sarah has asked, is there much disciplinary variance on the publishing side of things? Sarah says that I feel like attitudes towards publishing open access can vary massively between academics depending on what discipline they're based in. So is that replicated on the publishing side?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it is replicated in the sense that publishing staff are very aware, or try to be as aware as they can of the pressures and priorities and attitudes of the people who produce and who read the work that they publish. I know that when I've been in discussions with sort of peers, I suppose, working in publishing, who work in the humanities or who work for learning societies in the humanities, that they're very keen that those views are represented. Yeah, so I would say that in general, publishing staff and kind of workers are eager to just sort of reflect and serve the needs and the views of their kind of counterparts across the other side. So yeah, that's a long way to say yes, it is.
That's great, thank you. I think we're going to have to finish there because we're just coming up on time, and I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to have a break. But if everybody in the chat could just express their thanks to Charles, and for me personally, thank you so much for coming along and giving a really great session. Thank you very much, everybody, and Charles particularly. So we're going to take a break now. We've got a 50-minute break before we go on to our next session, which is a keynote. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, Charles.